This project started because one of my colleagues is from Detroit and went home, and he had never taken the Motown Museum tour. So the Motown Museum is where they started making records in Detroit. Barry Gordy's studio was his house to begin with, right? And then it grew from there. It was like Monopoly. You just kept adding house after house. But the studio started out at 2648. So you see up there in the top there, you see 2648. That's basically what you're looking at in the GUI. What you're
Hmm.
looking at in the GUI is the chamber that his dad built in the attic of that particular house. And then eventually these two houses basically connected, and 2648 was the one on the left and 2644 was the one on the right. If you go there today, those houses are fully joined. It's like one big house now. They used to use a bathroom for their reverb chamber, echo chamber, and it was inconvenient because it was still also the bathroom. So it didn't take long before they said, hey, let's build our own chamber. What do we have to use? We have an attic. And so the attic is what it is. So you have whatever amount of space you have. You have Pop Gordy, who's kind of a jack of all trades guy. He's actually a grocer, very successful man in the Detroit, community. But he also, is helping his son to make his business. So my contact, John Went, who's a Hitsville alumnus, started at the studio at the age of 19. And his very first job was to clean out the attic to make room for Pop Gordy to go build the chamber. So what you see here is basically what Pop Gordy built. It's what we consider nowadays hardy board, like the thinnest kind you can get. It's all those walls. They're very
Right.
thin. He did, put a concrete floor down. It's probably like thin set equivalent of today, not very thick. And that is what he built because this is what you could build inside that attic. There's still surrounding attic space, but not much at all. It basically goes to the top of the attic and goes out as wide as they could go, with still allowing some crawl space access around it. There's another door on the other end that puts you out to the windows, right? So if you look at that little icon, yeah, at the very peak, you see some windows at the very top. So if you're looking the other
Uh,
way in the chamber, that's where those windows are. You see where it says chamber one, 2648? And in that little icon, you see at the very top, there's some windows. So this chamber is way up there. It's not perfect, but it's what they built. My colleague went to take the tour. He's from Detroit. He had never taken the tour. And there's a moment in the tour where there's basically an attic hole in the ceiling, like somebody pulled the door out of an attic. And the docent says, hey, we need a volunteer. Can somebody shout or sing up into that space? You hear this amazing reverb coming back at you just acoustically. It's just part of the tour. And so for somebody like myself and my colleague, that was like the coolest part of the tour by far.
yeah.
So he comes back all excited. Hey man, we really need to get a licensing deal with the Hitsville Museum. Their reverb chambers are still there. I love Motown Records to bring something back that hasn't been functioning since 1972. We went March of 2020 to visit right before lockdown and gave him a demo of some of the things we'd already done. And it was for, this chamber. And I don't know if you know, but we also modeled they made a lot of, they're almost like the equivalent of Abbey Road, where EMI had their own team of engineers designing things. They had a, really sophisticated, talented group of people that supported the studios. So anyway, we did emulate their custom EQ, not only their mix EQ, but their disc EQ. But this was the thing that we really wanted to do. And so because of COVID, we couldn't do it right away. So we ended up modeling the EQ first. But once in the meantime, there's a lot of research that needed to be done on this. So the beautiful thing was these attics and the chambers themselves were intact, untouched. And of course, they opened up more modern studios and the house was still used, but they built other studios in Detroit. And then eventually Barry Gordy and a lot of the people moved to LA, and Motown ended up taking root in LA big time. Um, but Esther Gordy, Barry's sister, still lived in Detroit, and people would want to come see the original studio. They would get these private tours with Esther Gordy to see the old house where it all started. And that's kind of the origin of the whole thing. So when my colleague heard these chambers are still there, we took a visit in March 2020 and saw that this hadn't been touched in years. It was like a junk room, but the walls were still intact. No equipment was there. See that little door on the floor
Yeah.
there? That is the hole that you sing up into from below. It was send and return like a standard chamber would be. So with microphones and speakers tied in from the control room. So the big part of the project was how do we recreate what these chambers were actually set up like? So this guy, John Wint, that I mentioned earlier, it took about a year to find this guy. I was talked to Mike McLean, who was the chief tech engineer there. I eventually found John Wint, who is super sharp. He's probably 81 at the moment and had basically a photographic memory how everything was done. And it turned out in 2648, he was the one that landed on what you see if you click back in 2648, this setup where you got this 8-inch driver pointed in a corner with Electro-Voice tweeters in a short array
These
firing.
are the tweeters here.
Yep.
And this is the what again, you said?
It's an 8-inch Bozak driver in a 12-inch cube box, which is
Okay.
exactly what they had. The original setup was just mono, but a 545, SM57 equivalent mic pointed right into the corner. So if you drag that mic right onto the X,
Uh,
it's exactly what the setup was, right? So the original setup was in that far corner over there by the door. And, we replicated the same setup in the other corner to get a stereo effect. Basically, this is the quintessential Motown sound. They try different mics and different setups with the drivers in the room, but to get the best sound, John would be up there and then the engineers would be down below and he would experiment with things until they finally
ah,
got on something that really worked. And it was a little happenstance, like John needed to take a break and he moved that mic out from in front of the door. And
this one.
yeah, he dragged it. It was probably somewhere else and he moved the mic kind of into the corner. And the engineer said below, "Oh, that's it. We like that." And
Huh.
so from that little moment, he kind of perfected it where he put the drivers right into the corner. He's pointing the microphone directly into the corner. Everything's kind of firing into that corner and being picked up behind it by that mic. So, the like I said, the room's not really ideal. It's got parallel surfaces. It's not 100% parallel because it's got sag and it's imperfect. But this is the quintessential Motown sound right here. There was permutations. Like if you go to the speaker, the JB2482, down there in the bottom right. That is what they call the foghorn. So if you go down to see where their reverb chamber badge is,
Uh-huh.
so that was the later horn driver that they added because they kept blowing up those 8-inch drivers. So out of practicality, they changed to this, which is a different sound. It's a pretty cool sound too. What you get in this plugin is sort of the history of all the different setups.
Mm-hmm.
So if you click over to the microphone side of this,
Yeah.
they never had this exact setup, but they did have that mic. So it's giving you all the tonal flavors of what the history of all the different mics that were used. Later on, yeah, the KM86, they actually got rid of almost every mic, and the studio only used KM86s for everything for a while. So you're looking at all these speaker options, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's basically the history of how they had the chamber set up, over time. So they use those Altec speakers at one point, and at some point they put in Bose hi-fi speakers. You basically get a well-rounded set of options for tonality changes and variations in the sound. And there's actually a mono version of the plugin too, if you wanted to. The great thing about this, it's a chamber, so it's the most basic reverb, and it's like the birth of artificial reverb, right? Putnam was actually the first one to have a hit record with artificial reverb, send and return.
Is that right? What was it?
It was called Pego My Heart by the Harmonicats. It was a novelty band that was, bass harmonica, all the sizes. There's nothing in terms of using this tool, nothing too particular about it. It's like any other reverb, but it has a very specific fingerprint of sound with the way these attics sound, the way these drivers sound, these mics sound.